the impossible death. Imagine you've worked your whole life to climb to the very top. You've built wealth, power, and a reputation that demands respect wherever you go. You're the kind of person who can pick up the phone and make things happen, business deals, political favors, even whispers in the financial world that move millions. You live in luxury, in a sprawling mansion with marble floors, fountains, and the kind of art most people only see locked behind glass in museums. Now imagine that person, a man who survived market crashes, corporate betrayals, and even an attempted kidnapping years earlier, being found face down in 2 inches of water in his own estate. 2 inches. Enough to wet your shoes, enough for a child to splash in, yet it somehow claimed the life of a man who had everything. And what makes this story even more disturbing? When investigators leaned closer, what they discovered didn't just defy logic, it tore open a chilling possibility. Maybe this wasn't an accident at all. High voltage. Before we dive in, if you love mysterious, unsettling, and emotionally gripping stories that blur the line between reality and nightmare, make sure you hit subscribe. Stories like this one come out always, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's next. The man's name was Charles Whitmore, a 58-year-old international banker whose life was practically a catalog of success. He was born into privilege but didn't just coast on inheritance. Colleagues described him as relentless, brilliant, and sometimes dangerously ambitious. He controlled billions in assets and had friends in high places, but he also had enemies. Lots of them. On the morning of his death, the Whitmore estate was buzzing with its usual routine. Staff members moved through the manicured halls, gardeners clipped roses, and security patrols swept the grounds. It was ordinary. Normal. Safe. But at 8:47 a.m., everything changed. One of his domestic staff, a housekeeper named Elena, walked into the sunlit atrium where a decorative fountain sat, just a shallow ornamental pool barely filled with water. There, sprawled unnaturally, was Charles Whitmore, motionless, his face submerged in the water that barely covered the marble base. Elena screamed, and within minutes, security was on the scene. They tried reviving him, but it was already too late. By the time paramedics arrived, Charles was gone. The official report listed the cause of death as drowning. But here's the thing, everyone who knew Charles, even briefly, refused to believe it. He was tall, fit, an avid swimmer, and not the type to collapse into a fountain and just die. Something about the image didn't make sense. And when whispers began spreading that Charles had been making dangerous deals, that he had been receiving late-night phone calls full of threats, people started asking the real question: was this really an accident, or was Charles silenced? The suspicion. Authorities tried to downplay it at first. A tragic accident, they said. He may have fainted, suffered a medical episode. But quietly, within the halls of law enforcement, there were doubts. The shallow pool was wide, but it was only 2 inches deep. Even if Charles had fainted, his body should have shifted naturally to the side, his face turning upward as he regained consciousness. Yet he was pressed forward, face buried. Almost like he'd been held there. And as if things weren't strange enough, the coroner's report added fuel to the fire. Charles had bruising along his wrists, marks that looked disturbingly like he'd been restrained before his death. High voltage, and that's where the story begins to spiral. Because what starts as a bizarre death in a shallow pool quickly unravels into something much darker, a trail of secrets, betrayal, and power plays that will make you question if Charles was ever in control of his own fate at all. Before we get there, let me know in the comments, what's your gut feeling right now, tragic accident, or carefully staged murder? The cracks beneath the marble. When news of Charles Whitmore's death broke, the media couldn't get enough of it. Banker found dead in fountain plastered headlines across Europe and the US, each outlet running with the bizarre angle: how does a man worth hundreds of millions die in what amounted to little more than a puddle? On television, polished anchors wore somber faces as they discussed his legacy, the charities he'd funded, the schools he'd built, and the countless jobs tied to his investments. But in hushed tones, behind the newsroom scripts, journalists whispered what everyone else was thinking: this man had enemies. Powerful ones. The perfect illusion. Publicly, Charles was a man of refinement. He collected fine wines, he sat on museum boards, he was photographed with presidents and prime ministers. His image was untouchable until people began to dig deeper. Because behind the gala dinners and charity auctions, Charles's empire wasn't built on just banking. He was deeply tied to offshore accounts, black money transfers, and allegations of financing deals that governments wanted no part of. Even stranger, his closest associates reported something unusual in the weeks leading to his death. Charles had grown paranoid. He ordered additional security measures at his estate, replacing long trusted guards with an entirely new team. He refused to eat at restaurants unless he picked the table. He even confided to a colleague that he believed he was being followed by people he couldn't name. And then there was the phone call. 2 weeks before his death, Charles's personal assistant overheard him in his study, his voice low, almost trembling. She couldn't hear the entire conversation, but one sentence stuck with her like glass in her mind. "If I go down, you're going down with me." The investigation begins. Detectives began combing through Charles's mansion. They didn't find signs of forced entry, but they did find something disturbing: a shattered glass tumbler on the floor of his private office and traces of a dark liquid that wasn't wine, coffee, or any drink Charles was known to have. They also discovered that in the 48 hours before his death, Charles had transferred an enormous sum of money, almost $80 million, into a newly opened account in the Cayman Islands. The account was under a name that no one recognized. The question was simple: why? Was Charles moving money to protect himself, or was someone forcing him to? But then investigators uncovered something even more bizarre. Charles's security cameras, all 42 of them, went dark between midnight and 3 a.m. on the night he died. Every single one. When questioned, the head of security, a man hired only a few months earlier, claimed it was a power surge. But the estate had backup generators specifically designed to prevent outages. That's when detectives started to consider a chilling possibility: maybe Charles didn't just fall into that fountain. Maybe someone wanted him there. The family speaks. The Whitmore family didn't help matters. His wife, elegant and carefully composed in public, broke down during questioning, admitting Charles had been receiving threats. She confessed that in the final week, he'd woken up screaming from nightmares, muttering words she didn't understand. The water, Bill drowned me in the water." To investigators, it sounded like nonsense. But later, those words would return with terrifying clarity. His eldest son, Alexander, was less cooperative. He refused to hand over his phone, dodged questions about business disputes, and seemed more concerned with his inheritance than his father's death. To some, he looked like a grieving son. To others, he looked like a suspect. High voltage quick reminder: if you're gripped by this mystery and want more stories that twist and unravel in the most haunting ways, subscribe right now. That way you'll always be the first to catch the next one. The chilling details. The coroner's office released their final report, and while the bruises on Charles's wrists were inconclusive, there was something else: traces of a sedative in his system. Enough to make him disoriented, weak, unable to fight back. Which made his death look less like an accident and more like an execution. But the most haunting clue came not from the coroner, not from the police, but from a neighbor's security camera across the road. At 2:16 a.m., a black SUV was spotted entering the private road that led to the Whitmore estate. At 2:49 a.m., the same SUV was seen leaving. The vehicle's license plate? Missing. The problem: none of the Whitmore staff recalled seeing or hearing a car at that time. And with the estate's cameras down, there was no internal footage to prove who came or left. It was as if someone had slipped in, committed the perfect crime, and vanished into the night. The tension builds. At this point, Charles's drowning wasn't just strange, it was sinister. Detectives now had motive, method, and mystery. The motive: money laundering, betrayal, or revenge. The method: drugs and restraint. The mystery: who had the access, and the guts, to kill one of the most powerful bankers in Europe. But as they dug deeper, the investigation began pointing to people closest to Charles. And what they would uncover next would rip the Whitmore family apart. High voltage. Pause for a second. If you were investigating, who would you suspect right now? The ambitious son, the mysterious SUV visitors, or someone even closer to Charles? Drop your thoughts below. The Empire of Shadows. For weeks, Charles Whitmore's drowning dominated the news cycle. But while the public gawked at headlines, investigators were digging into something far darker: his Empire of Shadows. On paper, Charles was the definition of respectability. His companies were legitimate, registered, and compliant. But hidden behind layers of shell corporations and offshore accounts was a darker reality. Charles wasn't just moving money, he was moving power. Investigators found links to weapons contracts, sanctioned nations, and backdoor funding pipelines for regimes that governments publicly condemned while privately courting. Charles wasn't a banker. He was a power broker. And the deeper they dug, the more they realized his death might not have been personal, it might have been political. The betrayals began. Through confidential informants, detectives learned that Charles had been preparing for something massive. Just weeks before his death, he'd brokered a deal worth billions, one that would cut certain partners out completely. One of those partners? His own protégé, a man named Daniel Reeves. Reeves had been brought into Charles's inner circle a decade earlier, a young genius with numbers and nerves of steel. Charles groomed him, gave him influence, and eventually made him his second in command. But according to leaked emails, Reeves had discovered Charles was about to betray him. And Reeves wasn't the kind of man to forgive quietly. The emails hinted at heated exchanges, coded, but chilling. "You don't drown men like me, Charles. You drown yourself." The SUV mystery. Detectives tracked the mysterious SUV seen near the estate. It belonged to a rental company, booked under a fake ID that led nowhere. But fingerprints inside the vehicle told another story. They matched an associate of Reeves. This associate, known only as Vargas, was a former private contractor with a history of cleanup jobs in conflict zones. If Vargas was in that SUV, it meant Reeves might have been moving against Charles long before the fountain. But Reeves wasn't the only one with a motive. The son's secrets. Charles's eldest son, Alexander, lived a life of excess, nightclubs, gambling, and debts that spiraled into the millions. When investigators traced financial records, they uncovered that Charles had been covering those debts for years. But in the months before his death, Charles cut him off. Even worse, Alexander's phone records placed him at a private meeting with, of all people, Daniel Reeves just 3 days before Charles died. Was this grief-stricken son secretly conspiring with the very man his father was about to betray? Or was he being manipulated into something far darker? The wife's revelation. The widow, elegant but fractured, called investigators back to the estate. She handed them something she claimed she had hidden out of fear, a sealed envelope left in Charles's desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in Charles's hand. "If anything happens to me, look at those closest to me. The betrayal won't come from strangers. It never does." The letter didn't name names. But it confirmed what investigators were already beginning to suspect: Charles knew his death was coming. High voltage. Quick break. If you're hooked by the twists in this story, hit that subscribe button now. We dive into stories like this always, and each one will keep you questioning everything you thought you knew. The night of the death. Reconstructing Charles's final hours, investigators pieced together chilling details. At 11:32 p.m., Charles received a phone call. His phone logs show it came from a secure satellite line used by only 3 people in his circle. 2 of those people were confirmed to be out of the country. The third? Daniel Reeves. At 12:05 a.m., estate staff recalled hearing muffled voices from Charles's office. They didn't intervene. Charles often held private, heated calls late at night. By 1:10 a.m., all security cameras went offline. At 2:16 a.m., the SUV entered the estate road. At 2:49 a.m., it left. At 8:47 a.m., Charles was discovered dead in the fountain. Every piece of the puzzle pointed to coordination, timing, precision. This wasn't a collapse. This wasn't chance. This was a message. The drowning ritual. Then came the most haunting discovery. Investigators pulled historical files connected to Charles's dealings. In one of them, a confidential report surfaced about a secret syndicate, a group of financial and political figures who enforced loyalty through a brutal, symbolic punishment. Their method? Drowning powerful men in shallow water. It was designed to humiliate, to strip the victim of dignity. Not just to kill, but to send a message to anyone else considering betrayal: you're not untouchable. We control even the air you breathe. If that report was accurate, Charles's death wasn't just about money, or revenge, or family. It was a ritual. And that raised the most terrifying question of all: who else was next? High voltage question for you: do you think Charles's death was orchestrated by Reeves alone, or do you believe it was part of this larger, sinister syndicate? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to see where you stand. The walls close in. By the time investigators reached the 4th week of the Whitmore case, the accident narrative had completely collapsed. What they had wasn't a drowning, it was a coordinated assassination. But now came the hardest part: proving it. Because the deeper they went, the more resistance they faced. Files went missing. Witnesses retracted statements. Even government officials who had initially demanded answers were suddenly silent. It was as though someone with enormous reach was pulling strings to keep Charles's true cause of death buried. The syndicate connection. The confidential report about the drowning ritual sent investigators spiraling. They quietly reopened old cases of other mysterious deaths involving high-profile financiers. To their shock, they found 3 similar drownings in the past decade, each in shallow water, each dismissed as freak accidents. One in Paris, one in Dubai, and one in Sao Paulo. All victims were linked by one thing: they had business dealings with a hidden financial group nicknamed the Circle, a shadowy syndicate that Charles was believed to be part of, until he tried to break away. If the pattern held, Charles's death wasn't random. It was punishment for disloyalty. The breakthrough. The breakthrough came from something almost overlooked. A forensics analyst re-examined the fibers found on Charles's wrist bruises. They weren't from rope or cuffs, they were silk, tightly woven. Cross-referenced against estate records, only one person had access to such bindings: his wife's personal belongings. At first glance, this seemed absurd. But then the widow's behavior took on a chilling new light. She had been quick to steer suspicion toward the son and Reeves. She had also been the one to deliver the letter warning of betrayal. Was she a grieving widow? Or was she playing the perfect part in a script written long before Charles ever hit the water? The widow's secret. Investigators subpoenaed her financial records and uncovered a jaw-dropping detail. In the days following Charles's death, she moved $42 million into an account tied directly to Daniel Reeves. The elegant widow and the ambitious protégé, tied together by money. It was the crack investigators needed. The betrayal Charles warned about wasn't just from his circle. It was from his own family. High voltage. Before we go further, if you're hooked right now, make sure you're subscribed. Stories like this one aren't just about mystery, they're about betrayal, fear, and the haunting reality that sometimes the enemy is closer than you think. And you don't want to miss the next one. The confession that wasn't. Armed with evidence, investigators brought in Reeves for questioning. Calm, confident, he denied everything. But when they confronted him with the $42 million transfer, his mask cracked for the briefest second. Then he leaned forward and said something that made the room go cold. Charles wasn't murdered. Charles was delivered. He wouldn't elaborate. But to investigators, that single word, delivered, confirmed the syndicate's ritualistic influence. The sun breaks. While Reeves stonewalled, Alexander, the son, finally broke. In a tearful outburst, he admitted he had met Reeves days before the death. But according to him, Reeves had promised him control of parts of Charles's empire if he cooperated. Alexander swore he didn't know his father would die. He thought Reeves was planning a hostile takeover of the business, not an execution. But his admission placed him squarely inside the conspiracy. He had betrayed his father without even realizing the full cost. The terrifying discovery. As investigators closed in, one final discovery confirmed their worst fears. Hidden inside Charles's encrypted laptop was a list of names, dozens of them. Politicians, businessmen, even royalty. All tied to the circle. And next to some names was a chilling mark, a small water droplet. Cross-checking the list, investigators realized every person with a water droplet was dead. And Charles's name was marked the same way. This wasn't just about one man. This was a global network deciding who lived and who drowned. High voltage, here's where I want your thoughts. If you uncovered a list like this, would you go public and risk your life, or bury it and walk away? Drop your answer. I want to see how brave you really are. The net tightens. By the close of Act 4, investigators had their suspects. A widow enriched by her husband's death. A son manipulated into betrayal. A protégé who might be more than just a partner, he might be a representative of the circle. But they also had something far bigger than suspects. They had a secret so powerful it could topple governments if revealed. The question wasn't just who killed Charles Whitmore. The question was who controlled the world he lived in, and who would stop at nothing to silence the truth. The final betrayal. The investigation into Charles Whitmore's death had spiraled far beyond a wealthy banker found in a shallow fountain. What began as a tragic mystery had grown into something that shook the very foundations of power. The widow. The son. The protégé. And looming over all of them, the shadowy syndicate known only as the Circle. By now, investigators had enough evidence to make arrests, but they also had something more dangerous than evidence. They had knowledge. Knowledge of a network that orchestrated deaths to send messages. Knowledge of corruption so high up the chain that prosecuting it might mean disappearing themselves. And that's when everything suddenly stopped. The silence. Overnight, the case file went dark. Federal officials stepped in, citing national security concerns. Detectives were reassigned. Key witnesses recanted or vanished. And the damning list of names found on Charles's laptop? It disappeared from evidence entirely. It was as though the world itself conspired to erase the truth. But fragments still surfaced. Enough to paint a chilling final picture of what happened on that night. The night reconstructed. Forensics, financial trails, and leaked testimony allowed investigators to piece together Charles's last hours. After receiving that late-night call, Charles wasn't afraid, he was resigned. He knew what was coming. He didn't flee, didn't fight. He simply waited. Some believe he had been promised mercy if he cooperated. Others think he knew resistance was useless. When the SUV arrived, Charles's wife was already awake. She led the visitors through the estate, bypassing security. Reeves entered the office first. Words were exchanged, heated but calm. Charles's son stood nearby, confused, believing this was just a business handover. Then came Vargas, the enforcer. He restrained Charles, forcing his wrists into silk ties. Charles didn't struggle. He whispered something instead. Witnesses never agreed on what, but some claimed it was. "I knew it would be the water." Minutes later, they walked him to the fountain. 2 inches of water. Enough for the ritual. Enough for the message. By morning, Charles Whitmore was gone, delivered, just as Reeves had said. The widow's reward. Within days of the death, Reeves and the widow quietly transferred the bulk of Charles's hidden accounts into new holdings. She became one of the richest women in Europe overnight. Reeves expanded his empire, stepping into the very role Charles once held. And the son? He was given scraps, barely enough to sustain his lifestyle. He had been used, a pawn in a game he never fully understood. His betrayal meant nothing to them, it was only symbolic, a cruel flourish to break Charles completely. The chilling aftermath. What made Charles's death unforgettable wasn't just the betrayal. It was the message. The Circle wanted the world of power brokers, oligarchs, and shadow financiers to know, no one was untouchable. Not even Charles Whitmore, a man who had built an empire out of money and secrets. And here's the most unsettling part: since his death, 2 more high-profile drownings have occurred under similar bizarre circumstances. Each dismissed as an accident. Each tied, quietly, to men who had crossed paths with the circle. The ritual continues. High voltage, if you've stayed with me through this story, here's my last call to action: make sure you're subscribed right now. Stories like this come out always, and every one is more unsettling than the last. And if you think this story is one people need to hear, share it. Because the deeper you look into the shadows, the more you realize, the truth doesn't stay buried forever. The final twist. Years later, a journalist uncovered something extraordinary in Charles's private journals, smuggled out of the estate. Scrawled in shaky handwriting, just weeks before his death, Charles had written a single, haunting line. "They will kill me where the water is shallow, but the betrayal will drown deeper than the fountain." And he was right. His fortune, his empire, his family, everything he had built, was washed away in that shallow pool. Not by water, but by betrayal. The impossible death of Charles Whitmore wasn't just a mystery. It was a warning. A reminder that sometimes, the most powerful men in the world don't die by chance. They die by design.